Good evening, good evening. Nice to see you all. It's Holy Week, it's our last Lenten talk, and we are delighted to have Austen Ivereigh with us. Austen probably requires no introduction, but I will attempt to introduce Austen. Austen has been to Sevenoaks, was it about 10 years ago, I think? 10 years ago, he very vaguely recalls. He travels the world, as you know, and he's going to talk about the triumph of failure. Why did God choose to suffer? And it's very much based on the way Pope Francis interprets and talks about the Passion Week. One mentions Austen's name by also mentioning Pope Francis, because Austen's life story is very, very interesting, because when I first knew Austen, he was a junior journalist, if I dare say that, because he'd been a Jesuit novice, and then he'd done a PhD in the Argentinian Catholic Church. This is in about 2008 or 2010. And he said, well, the thing about the Argentinian Church is no one is interested in the Argentinian Church. And then, lo and behold, we got an Argentinian Pope. So I guess, Austen, you kind of won the lottery at that point. And he became basically the I don't know how to express this, but the English language interpreter for Pope Francis. So he spends a lot of time speaking with American audiences and English-speaking audiences, and that's why we're so glad that Pope Francis also continues in good health, because I guess, as I don't want to be rude, but long may Pope Francis continue in good health. But I think today, you can talk to him about Pope Francis. He's been in Rome, and Pope Francis was in hospital, obviously. We were all terrified that was the last, but he fortunately recovered. And you can ask him about him, and you can ask him about Pope Francis. But also it's about Holy Week and getting ready for Easter. He also has a wonderful new book out, which he's signing, called On Retreat with Pope Francis. And I've read many books about Pope Francis. I would really recommend this one. This is probably the most, I would say, intensely spiritual work, which really interprets Pope Francis' thinking, particularly the Ignatian Jesuit thinking, how he interprets the world and what he's trying to do. So I found it a very, very powerful book, and I would really recommend that book to anyone. And he's signing copies as well at the end of the talk. So a warm welcome to Austen. You're most welcome.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's lovely to be with you. Are you hearing me well? That's good. That's good. Excellent. Good. Yes. So thank you for the invitation, which I understand is the second time I've been here. I struggle to remember the first, but I do remember being here, being around and in Ben's house, and it is really lovely to be with you again. So this book, which came out just last year, First Belong to God, On Retreat with Pope Francis, is an attempt to kind of bottle the pontificate spiritually. What is the spiritual conversion to which the pontificate is calling us? And this comes out of many people saying to me over the years, we love Francis, we love what he's trying to do, but there's too much to read. He's saying too much. How can we understand him in a simple, accessible way? And then in the British province of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, in 2020, asked me to give them a retreat, or rather with their collaborators, on the pontificate. And so I found myself thinking about the 8-day spiritual exercises, the 30-day spiritual exercises in a week's format, which I'm very familiar with, and how I could begin to tie together the different days of the exercises with the pontificate. And I was kind of amazed as I began to do this to see these connections, which of course should be fairly obvious given that this is the first Jesuit Pope. But nonetheless, this is the journey of conversion, First Belong to God. And First Belong to God comes from one of his beautiful documents, not much talked about, from 2018, called Gaudete et Exultate, Rejoice and Be Glad, on holiness. And the theme of belonging struck me at the time in 2020 as a very pertinent one, because of course we were then in lockdown and suddenly we were in isolation. We were thinking so much about our relationship with each other that this seemed to me a good topic. And I think since then it's become even more relevant. He himself, he's written the foreword to the book, and when I told him about it, I said, Father, I'm writing this book, I hope you don't mind, I'm calling it On Retreat with Pope Francis. And he said, oh, that's a great idea, what does the Pope think? But when I told him the name and the theme, he was very pleased, because in a way there is a theme underlying the pontificate, which is the relationship, first of all, with God, the relationship with creation, and the relationship with our fellow human creatures are the three dimensions of belonging which underlie, or the crisis in that belonging underlies all the crises that we face. So that's the book. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about tonight on the theme of the Passion and Holy Week is taken from one of the days here, day 7, which is in the spiritual exercises the third week, where we contemplate the Passion of Christ. So it's kind of based on that chapter. And that chapter really is nourished by some very powerful talks or retreat talks, which the then Father Jorge Mario Bergoglio gave in 1990 in a very difficult time in his life. And I'll tell you about that difficult time in a minute. But I remember when I was writing his biography in 2014, coming across these writings and being deeply struck by them. In order to understand the dynamic of the Passion. In other words, the nature of the way Jesus, or the way God saves us through the Passion of Christ. And I guess as a Catholic, I've always, I'm sure like many of you, often asked yourself the question that I've tried to put in the title. Why does Jesus suffer? Why does he need to suffer or choose to suffer? I mean, what I was really getting at by that subtitle is what Jesus says to the two disciples when they're walking to Emmaus, just after, in Luke's Gospel. The crucifixion has happened, and these two disciples are in a state of desolation because they cannot reconcile the person that they have known, that they followed, who was healing people, who was a man of such enormous power of healing and so on. How it was that he could end up crucified like a common criminal. So they were trying to reconcile these two things. And this stranger comes alongside them, who later they recognize as Jesus. And Jesus says to them, how foolish you are and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? Well, there are lots of different translations. Was it not necessary that the Messiah suffer, and so on? And then it goes on, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in the scriptures concerning himself. Now, I don't know whether you've ever contemplated the walk from Emmaus prayerfully and kind of put yourself there. Can you imagine what Jesus would say to you? When Jesus says to you, do you not get from the scriptures why that the Messiah had to suffer? And you say, no, it hadn't occurred to me. No, can you tell me? And then listen to him. Why was it necessary? How does this actually work? How does the salvation happen? How does God save us in this way? So when I came upon these meditations of Bergoglio's, I found this there was a clarity about them, which I loved and I came to understand. So this is what I'm going to share with you now. And this matters not just so that we understand conceptually what happens at Easter, but rather that we receive the fruits of it. That we enter into the mysteries of Easter, that we be changed by them. And I think the greatest fruit I've come to understand of Easter is captured in a word which Francis is using a lot at the moment. And it's this word patience. Now, patience we know of as a virtue. It's when you're standing in a bus queue and you don't complain. That's patience and so on. But I've come to understand it as a much richer term than that, through Francis, but also from the early church. See, the early church saw paciencia, as they called it, as the great Christian virtue. It was the compelling way that the Christians were that if you like, scandalized and bewitched pagan society. It was what marked Christians out. It was how they were, this idea of paciencia. So paciencia, patience, comes from patior, to suffer. So paciencia means suffering. And of course, when we talk about Christ's passio, his passion, that's another word for a kind of patient suffering. So in a prologue to his recent book in Spanish, reflecting on the theme, and I know you've already had a talk from Gemma Simmons on hope, but reflecting on hope, Francis says, quote, "Patience is not simply endurance or perseverance, it's knowing how to suffer well." And of course, you've read, I'm sure many of you, his bull of the Jubilee, which is called Hope Does Not Disappoint, where he describes patience as a fruit of the Holy Spirit and a grace to pray for. It is both the daughter of hope and at the same time its firm foundation. So we have a cluster of interconnected concepts here: suffering, patience, hope, and then another word, which is the word of the title, failure. And these have been very much on Francis's lips and his mind recently, of course, in his struggle with double pneumonia. I was out in Rome, as Ben said, for 2 weeks while he was in hospital. And he gave some short but quite extraordinary messages. For example, in one recent Angelus message, he said in his struggle with pneumonia, he had experienced the Lord's patience, so the patience of God, reflected in those who care for the sick, whose, quote, "trusting patience anchored in God's unfailing love is necessary in our lives, especially when facing the most difficult and painful situations." So this is a quality of God. Patience is a quality of God which, if you like, we as Christians, in entering into the Passion, come to reflect. Francis says that the patience of God is like that farmer who doesn't cut down the failing fig tree in Luke 13, but fertilizes it again and again in the hope that it will bear fruit. So we're talking here about a willingness to suffer in expectation of God's action. This is patience. According to the historian Alan Kreider, who's got this rather amazing book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, he says that actually this virtue of patience was so compelling in the early church that the first apologetic texts were on the very topic of patience. And they identified it as a kind of a habitus that intrigued and captivated society and was the principal reason why the church expanded in those first 2 centuries. So patience, meaning being humble, peaceful, not vengeful, not violent, not anxious, not controlling, forgiving, generous, kind. Shall I try a different microphone? Thank you for your patience. So I was just talking about this habitus or quality that the Christians exuded, which was identified by the first apologists as paciencia. And of course, the great emblem of patience that the early Christians constantly were shaped by was Christ himself. Patience itself, says Tertullian, who goes to the cross scorned and spat upon, showing that patience is the very nature of God. So just before I go into the text, a little bit of context about the text I'm going to talk about. The mountain city of Cordoba in northwest Argentina is where in 1990, aged 56, Father Jorge Mario Bergoglio, former provincial of the Jesuits, was sent by the Jesuits for a very strange time that would turn out to be close to 18 months. Now, we biographers refer to this as his exile, rather dramatically. But he doesn't disagree that it was dramatic. He describes it in a book that came out in 2024 as a long and dark period of my life when I was carrying a sense of defeat in my heart because although obediently I accepted the decision of my superiors, I didn't understand why they had sent me there. So he had exercised, if you know my biography, you'll know the story. By that time, he had exercised every possible leadership position in the province of the Society of Jesus, novice master, provincial, rector, and so on. He was probably the greatest church leader of his generation in Latin America. But now, for all sorts of complex reasons which I go into in the biography, a period of division within the Jesuits for which he was being blamed, some might say scapegoated. He's banished to Cordoba and basically given no responsibility. He was a confessor. His task was simply to hear confessions. So really, you can imagine like having his ground completely taken away from him. So during this time, again, he's described this, he was withdrawn, he was certainly depressed, he seldom went out. He tended to the elderly in the house, and indeed he heard confessions, a very important ministry. But otherwise, he spent most of his days inside reading, writing retreat talks, reflections. For a man of action and governance, which we know Francis is, it was an extraordinary time of inaction and powerlessness, which triggered a kind of midlife anguish in him. And what made it even more painful was to see that so much of what he had built up in the Argentine province was now being dismantled by the people who had sidelined him. So he's experiencing not just his own failure and humiliation, but the apparent failure of all that he's spent his life essentially trying to build. Now, seen in the rearview mirror from the perspective of today, we can say, and he would say, it was an enormously fruitful time of intense suffering, which gave many fruits. Without that growth that he underwent at that time, many of his collaborators say, he would not be the Pope that he is today. And many of you may be familiar with that time of sort of midlife crisis where basically everything collapses, but you emerge from it in a way a much deeper and more mature person. Most of us can relate to that. But that wasn't clear to him at the time. In fact, at the time, he felt it as a completely dark night for which there was no way out. And he said, referring to May 1992, when Pope John Paul II made him auxiliary bishop of Buenos Aires, he said, when the situation resolved, it was like a door opening for me. So there hadn't been no door until that point. Now, during his exile, so-called exile, is when I think he wrote some of his most powerful writings. And because actually he was always so busy, he seldom had time to write the way he wrote there. And one of them was this retreat he gave for some priests on what he called the priestly flesh of Christ, which vividly explored dimensions of the passion, which of course he was living. In other words, he was living, his own sense of exile, his own sense of failure, and so on. He was living that at the time he was giving this. And he was learning to live in faith and prayer with that desolation, noting, as a good Jesuit, the temptations and the obstacles to grace. And one of them, he notes, for example, is victimhood. To believe yourself a victim is to, in other words, make it all about you. You see yourself as the victim of everything else. At that moment, he says, you cease to serve the gospel and you serve yourself. You no longer pray because you complain. And this, he says, is a kind of a blasphemy. In making ourselves the victims, we are making ourselves self-sufficient, incapable of coming out of ourselves. And you can see when he's writing about this, he's obviously experiencing these temptations himself. But the main point of these meditations that I found very powerful is that he shows that it is we only allow ourselves to transcend the state that we're in if we're willing to enter into and face the extent of our failure, the extent, in other words, of our suffering. And this, of course, is the wisdom of traditional Catholic devotion. On Friday, we will be venerating the cross. We will be spending time in front of the cross, entering into the sadness, the cruelty of the crucifixion. But what Bergoglio is saying is, this is how we have to do it. We have to enter into the flesh, if you like, of Christ's suffering. Because it is only in this way that we understand how, and here's the word I want to use, he entered into patience. So let's look at this, his contemplation of the retreat, and try and answer those questions. Why does God save us this way? How does that salvation happen? So first of all, he considers how Jesus goes to his death, that his patience is not simply passivity or resignation. And it's true, if you look at the Gospels, Jesus is always running away, when they're trying to capture him. He knows when the moment has come, and he chooses then to suffer. So this isn't resignation, but it's accepting that there is a time in all of our lives when we are, as it were, called to suffer. To accept that there is no human escape from where we are, but to trust in God's action. And then he says there's the radicality of the way Jesus empties himself. In other words, empties himself of anything that he could cling to as a defense. Now, this, of course, turns out to be, in Bergoglio's telling, the secret of the effectiveness of the cross. He uses a 17th century metaphor by Maximus the Confessor, who compares Christ on the cross to a baited hook used by a fisherman. The poisoned bait is Jesus' meekness, his lack of resistance, which the devil interprets as weakness, because he can only conceive the divine in terms of power and strength. St. Ignatius says in the exercises that God goes into hiding, or divinity goes into hiding in the Passion. You cannot see that this is God on the cross. And the reason for that is because it is precisely because of the weakness, because of the powerlessness, in the eyes of the devil, he has won. And therefore, completely devoid of any constraint or need to conceal, he hurls, as it were, everything at Jesus. Now read the Passion, read the Gospel story as the unleashing of a diabolical kind of fury against the single victim. And you'll see what I mean. Everything, from the temple guards to the Roman soldiers to the interrogations to Pilate and so on. Every kind of power is directed, as it were, at Christ. And what happens is that as this happens, evil reveals itself. The diabolical reveals itself. Now, some of you may know the writer René Girard. I really like the way he puts it. Jesus achieves victory over Satan, he writes, through a renunciation of violence so complete that violence can rage to its heart's content without realizing that by so doing, it reveals what it had tried to conceal. I'm sorry for the complexity of the sentence, but you get the idea. Look, one way to understand it is a battle between two kinds of power. One is what one might call worldly power, domination, where it's about raw power, leverage, if you like, domination. And to use another word, that's the power of impatience, the power of violence. Yeah? And then there's the kind of power which Christ is showing forth, which is the power of God, which is the power of patience. And the way it works is to unmask what is diabolical, to reveal, in other words, what is of God and what is of Satan, what is, if you like, worldly power and what is holy. So here you see the power of God in action in the cross. Here's what we have, what Girard would call the single victim mechanism, or the scapegoat mechanism. Because what normally happens in society is that a single victim or a group of people are deemed bad, unworthy, sinful. And the punishment inflicted on them is always justified as good and righteous. So in other words, violence is always justified as moral. And that's what happens in the Passion. Christ is condemned by people who are, what? Defending the Judaic religion from blasphemy, or they're protecting the Roman order from subversives and chaos and so on. The defenders of law and order always justify the immolation of the victim. What is exposed in the resurrection is that God is entirely free of that violence. So the satanic strategy depends on a moral justification of violence, which is exposed on the cross as not moral at all, as have nothing to do with God. Yeah, he's put to death for moral reasons, and those moral reasons are exposed in the resurrection. So, God is free of all violence, and this is the revelation that is given at the time to a very few people, but it will change the world. It will change history. So hence the idea of Maximus that this is a kind of a trick or a ruse. And it seems a bit shocking at first, as if God doesn't kind of lay traps. But as Girard says, actually it's an outworking of the divine logic. The divine logic is one of service, of love, of an emptying itself of power, which elicits a response of power, which then exposes that power for what it is. Does that make sense? At least when I entered into this, I began to understand, what St. Paul says in Corinthians about the rulers of this world not understanding the wisdom of God, for if they had done so, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So, had Jesus been, in other words, divine, in the sense that people think of divinity, strong, a kind of Superman type, they would not have put him to death. They kill him because he's pitiless, he's powerless, he's a nobody. He's deserving of contempt and punishment. And that's what the cross and the resurrection will expose as diabolical and will transform human society. And you only have to read Tom Holland's Dominion about the impact of this insight on Western society. So this is what Bergoglio is bringing out. Now, the next meditation that he gives is specifically on failure. It's called The Failure of Jesus. And I, by the way, translated that for the tablet in this week's Easter issue, if you want to read the actual text. It's not long. In it, I've got it with me actually, he expresses his debt to a book which was very helpful to him in this time of desolation, by the American Jesuit theologian John G. Navone, whose book is called Triumph Through Failure, A Theology of the Cross, but it's more startling in Italian, where it's simply La Teologia del Fallimento, the theology of failure. Essentially, I've read the book and it is fascinating. Essentially what Navone is doing is saying, we have this theology of hope in our Christian faith, but the problem is that it sort of ends up putting such an emphasis on the promises, the pull of a glorious future, that it requires a counterbalancing in what he calls a theology of failure. Because failure is the common lot of humanity. It's a more common experience, he says, than hope, because all of us must die. It's a very stark thing to say. But he makes you realize when you read this book how often we do speak about hope like this, as if it's the kind of the finale of a film, the nice ending. Oh, well, it all works out okay. You see this a lot in certain evangelical spiritualities, which really don't want to know about the cross. They very, very quickly go to the resurrection. But you can also see it in certain kind of, if you like, refined, educated circles where it's a bit distasteful to speak about the cross. But in fact, failure, Jesus' failure, is the way par excellence, Navone says, in which God reveals himself and accomplishes the salvation of mankind. There is no authentic Christianity without the willingness to risk failure. So Bergoglio, with these meditations, he looks back on salvation history and he observes something very important, which is that God usually intervenes only at the point where human failure is total. He takes the example we'll have at the Easter Vigil, the example of, in Exodus, of Moses, of course, the parting of the sea. But, Moses finds himself on the shore of the sea with the Egyptian army behind him. He hasn't got any options, Bergoglio says. He can either surrender to the Egyptians, he can make terms with them, he can commit suicide, or he can trust in God. And that's what Moses chooses to do. And at that point, says Bergoglio, God makes himself present in the radical impotence of human means. And of course, Jesus' failure on the cross is part of that same dynamic. Jesus accepts the complete absence of any option of escape. All his followers have fled. He dies the cruel death. And it's only at that point that God intervenes with the astonishing power of the resurrection. So the resurrection is God's intervention at the point of total impossibility of human hope. And by this means, says Bergoglio, God proclaims as Lord the one who accepted the path of failure in order that the power of the Father be revealed and glorified. So we tend to, it's a very common human reaction, we want to separate God somehow from human failure. We want to say somehow God makes it all right. But the truth is often our lives are marked by failure. And that doesn't mean that God isn't present or enacting in there. As the church's ancient rituals of the Passion help us to do, if we dwell on the Passion, if we enter into it, if we, as it were, suffer with Jesus, we experience, at least in our hearts and minds, something of the cruelty, of the mockery and the hostility of the crowds, the injustice of the charges against him, but also the failure of his own mission. Something, again, I think I hadn't really understood till I read Navone. Read the Gospels. After chapter 8 of Mark's Gospel, it's a failure. He no longer heals people. The crowds move away. The disciples start to leave him. Progressively, in all the Gospels, he ends up being abandoned and reviled. His mission to convert Israel fails by a country mile. He's condemned by the temple authorities. He's crucified by the Roman soldiers. Jesus, says Bergoglio, dies a failure, and it's only there on the cross that the unfathomability of his love is revealed. For only those who love much have the freedom and the vitality of spirit to accept failure. So we're talking here about a capacity to embrace failure, trusting that God will take it and act on it and bring it to fruition. This is paciencia, this is patience. Jesus, of course, never loses trust that God somehow will act. He never doubts that he's doing the will of his Father, once that will has become known in the Garden of Gethsemane. So Jesus embraces failure, I'm talking always about failure in human terms, in order to do the will of the one who sent me and to complete his work, he says in John. What's so remarkable about Jesus is that his failure is so total, and yet he is so attuned to the logic of the divine plan. Jesus can't know what God is going to do with his crucifixion, and yet he's so aligned with God's will that he accepts that whatever it is part of God's will. And this is the readiness to accept failure, says Navone, which is an essential condition for this freedom of spirit in God and Christ. That we cannot actually be Christian without it. We cannot live lives of receptivity and openness to God unless we are willing to embrace that failure in our own lives and in our own mission. Bergoglio, in fact, ends this reflection by saying that those Christians who seek to avoid the scandalous failure of the cross, their lives will be no more than a series of twists and turns through a more acceptable failure of the prettily packaged variety, right? So, sorry to add more and more complexity, but there are two kinds of failure that he's talking about here. See, there's the kind of failure of those who fear failure and avoid it, because they trust only in themselves, in their own self-sufficiency. That's the path one might call of mediocrity. As Navone says, fear of failure is succumbing to failure itself. Whereas the Christian is called to look at Christ and follow that example, which is to have the freedom and the vitality to embrace failure, confident that our actions are the seedbed in which God will sow a future we may not even live to see. So ultimately we're talking here about a capacity to suffer, but a capacity to be patient in suffering, confident that what is revealed will show us what is of God and what is not of God. And just to reflect for a few minutes on this, there's a great speech that the then Cardinal Bergoglio gave in the year 2000 to educators in Buenos Aires, and he was talking about the crises of our world. And it was on the theme of hope. In fact, it had the same title, Hope Does Not Disappoint. And in it, he begins by saying, the most important thing we can do in response to all these crises, of course, we need to respond, with new ways and so on. But the most important thing is that we have the openness of spirit to understand
what we are being called to do. He called this the way of discernment. And he contrasts this with two common standpoints, which are essentially self-sufficient, but also deeply misguided. See, the great thing about the Christian understanding of hope is that it starts from the reality, the truth of who we are, and how the world is. These two other stances which he critiques, one is the, if you like, what we might call the optimist or the techno-optimist, the liberal optimistic faith in historical progress, in markets, in technology, in science, and so on. All these impersonal forces which were apparently going to make everything better, which of course ignore the reality of human suffering, sin, and woundedness. And then that's one, if you like, non-Christian approach. And another one would be the pessimistic, apocalyptic view of those who have a kind of neurotic response to change and modernity, and they want to take refuge in select groups of the pure, convinced of the coming catastrophe. So against both of these, Bergoglio advances the way of discernment, which looks at history through the lens of faith against the horizon of God's kingdom. He takes the parable of the seed that grows by itself, Jesus' parable, and he says Jesus isn't speaking here of a history that matures over time until reaching its fullness. Rather, says Bergoglio, Jesus' parable seeks to show the kingdom as a reality which is hidden from human eyes, whose fruit will be produced by God's action, whatever the sower does. Does this mean that what we do is unimportant or meaningless? No, far from it. History, he says, is not wasted time, our story. Everything that is aligned with the kingdom, with truth, with freedom, with justice, with fraternity, all of this will be taken up and brought to fulfillment, whereas what opposes the kingdom will be discarded. So Christian hope is not a kind of a spiritual consolation. It's not there, it'll all be all right. It's much, much more dynamic than that. It frees us from this kind of fruitless determinism or pessimism and invites us to be bold, creative, joyful, and grateful in working for the kingdom, even when we do not see immediate results. And in fact, our failure in so much of what we do is what frees us from the myth of self-sufficiency. It's what opens us to God's action. It's what enables God to act. So Bergoglio says new responses are needed to all these crises, but ultimately it is this open spirit capable of a constructive discernment. Tertullian, who's probably considered the first ever theologian of the church, he lived in the 2nd century, he said the key to the hope of the way Christians live, their patient way of living, was precisely the death and resurrection of Christ. He said, impatient actions are hopeless because they cannot produce what they promise. Here's a quote from Tertullian. Nothing undertaken through impatience can be transacted without violence, and everything done with violence has either met with no success or has collapsed and plunged to its own destruction. On the other hand, he said, patience is the work of God. It was the inseparable companion of the Holy Spirit. And those who live this way offer their lives to God as a response to God's gift of patience to them. See, it's an interesting distinction that violence cannot ever build or create. And I was saying to Ben earlier, and I don't want to get too political, but you look at what's happening at the moment in America, the way Trump is going about things, whatever you think of what he's trying to achieve, the violence and the brutality with which he is doing it is sowing destruction and chaos. It's deeply, deeply anti-gospel, the way he's going about things. And yet there are Catholics in the United States who support him. Go figure, as they say. In other words, is there something for those people who believe in Christianity, who profess the dogmas and the truths of Christianity, but have not yet, as it were, learnt to live in the way that the cross and the resurrection asks us to, is perhaps one of the challenges that in our time we face. And here's a last thought. I've been involved in the Synod, as Ben said, and one of the beautiful things about the Synod is a call to a conversion of the way we are in the church. If you like, a conversion of our culture or our mindset. This is, to use an old distinction, fides qua, not fides quae. Fides quae is what we believe, the content of our faith. But fides qua is about how we are because of what we believe. It's the culture, the habitus, the thing that, as it were, strikes people about Christians, which Tertullian talked about in the early church. I think the Synod is inviting us into that journey of conversion. And some people find this a bit challenging because they want faith to be about content of what we believe. But in reality, what makes the church grow, it did in the early church and it will again in our time, is a transformed way of being. And at the heart of that transformed way of being is patience, in the sense that the early church understood it. To enter into patience is a way of being, confident that God is at work, confident that if we suffer failure in a way that's open to transcendence, that's open to the gift of the Spirit, that God will somehow take that and use it, and that the church will grow, like the mustard seed, like the plant that grows by itself. So it's not resignation, it's not despair, it's not a kind of endurance test, it's not stoicism, it's not a superhuman fortitude. All those things put trust in ourselves. Christian hope born of patience avoids all triumphalism or optimism. In fact, it's confident not so much in us, but in God's action. And so I wonder whether we're called to do this now, to embrace again this way of being, which the Synod is inviting us to. The synodality itself is what belonged to the early church. Because we're living now and we're moving into a very different era, you may have noticed, in the church. Thomas Halleck has a beautiful book called The Afternoon of Christianity, which describes this very well. The old model that so many of us grew up with, and certainly was true of the 1950s, is collapsing. Because the age in which we live is very different from that age. And there's much to be said about this, and we can get into it in the Q&A. But perhaps it is about this call to live Christianity in a way that transforms ourselves, that we create these communities of witness which strike people around us in our impatient world by their patience. That we're no longer, as it were, handing down rules from above, but giving witness from below, from a place of powerlessness. The culture, in other words, of Christianity itself. There's an invitation for us to convert there. It's about learning again this capacity for patience, which is what we learned fundamentally by contemplating the cross and the resurrection. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I do realise as I was speaking that it was complicated. So
yeah,
I
wonderful.
hope it wasn't too
Thank you,
complex.
thank you, Austen. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, and maybe I can kick off if you don't mind. It's a bit of a tricky question, which is, so Pope Francis has been Pope now for 12 years, I think, and just talk about, I don't know, even a few minutes, his success and maybe not his failure, but maybe things he hasn't seen the fruits of yet that he's sown.
Well, when I was out in Rome, a lot of the world's media had arrived because the Pope was in hospital, and they were expecting a papal transition. So it was a very strange time, and of course, I was giving a lot of interviews where it was exactly this question. So what do we say is the result? What's the great achievements, of the last 12 years? And Francis, who hates, I think, any kind of triumphalism, would be the first to say he's been sowing seeds that others will reap or harvest in the future. I would say that his signal achievement has been a little bit what I was talking about at the end of my remarks. The transformation or conversion, whatever you want to call it, of the culture of the church. I think he's been leading the way in this because he understands that we are living and entering into a very different time And to evangelize this new time, we need to be different. And by say different, I really mean more converted, more centered on Christ, because all growth in the church is ultimately conversion, a recovery, perhaps, of what we've lost. So I think the way he has exercised the papacy, his proclamation of the tenderness and the love and the mercy of God, the culture of accompaniment, that this is that the church be called to act more like Jesus in accompanying people and listening to them and creating opportunities for them to grow. All of this, I think, has marked the pontificate. I would say the synod will be one of his great legacies because it is the most significant way in which we can learn that new culture. And I have a lot more to say about his conversion of the culture of the Vatican, which I think is one of his huge achievements. The bishops now go to Rome and they say, it's very different from how it used to be. We used to be treated like altar boys. You know, we were given orders and told what to do. Now we go to Rome and the dicasteries say, how can we help? You know, the Pope has asked us to listen to you. And that transformation is really remarkable, from a culture, if you like, of domination to one of service. To transform a culture in that way is a huge achievement. I think his great achievement in his apostolic visits has been to show that Christianity is lived and will be lived increasingly by small and powerless groups. You know, Christianity will not be powerful in the future, and that the potency of its witness will come from the testimony that it gives in how it is. I could go on, but those would be, I would say, the few achievements.
We have a few gremlins, so we'll be...
Yeah, I can see it's very active, gremlins.
So who wants to ask a question first?
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, William, yeah.
So I've got two little questions, if I may. The first one is, why is it if you go to Mass on a Sunday in Toulouse in southern France, there are only 18 people in the cathedral, but 300, mostly younger people, are instituted Christ the King? And also, how do you fancy Uncle Arthur Roach's chances?
Okay. The second question was in reference to our Rome-based English Cardinal Arthur Roach, who's head of the Dicastery for Divine Worship, and his prospects of being made Pope. I just thought I'd explain that. Look, your first question is about the rise of traditionalists among the young. Before I answer that question, we need to understand that what's going on statistically at the moment, and it's really, really interesting. I think I checked with a couple of you before, and I think in Southwark it's also true, but nationwide in England and Wales, we've lost about a third of our congregations since COVID. A third. And the people who are no longer coming are mostly cultural Catholics. People, in other words, who became Catholic because their family was Catholic and they imbibed it as part of their identity. I'm not saying that there's not genuine faith there, but there was a loyalty to the institution which they received, as it were, through these transmission belts of culture and institutions, which is no longer suddenly there. Okay. When asked why they no longer come to church, they generally say, I didn't think I would be missed. Something really important is happening there, which is the collapse of cultural Catholicism, which is exactly what Francis and the Latin American Church foresaw back in 2007, when they undertook this kind of discernment of the signs of the times. And what they said was that the Christianity of the future, faith, will be born not of inheriting through culture, but will come about through the experience of the encounter with the mercy of God. In other words, it's firstly an experience and it's always an encounter, which then opens the heart and mind to receiving faith. Now, the proof of that is in the other really interesting statistic at the moment, which is the dramatic rise of people becoming Catholic in European major cities at Easter. I'm really bad on figures, so I'm not going to try, but the graph is literally like that, okay? I know Southwark Cathedral's reported a very strong uptick, Westminster, the big cities, Cardiff. And who are the people becoming Catholic? They're mostly young, and they're mostly coming from a non-religious background, so agnostic or whatever. Again, this is exactly what Halik would say is the afternoon of Christianity. Why does this shift matter? Because the church, in many ways at the moment, is built for the old model rather than built for the new model. And the new model requires us to accompany the seekers and the searchers, as Halleck calls them. The people, in other words, who have experienced an alienation from modernity, and they have come in search of Christ, or they've had an experience which they then want to deepen. Is the church ready to receive them, walk with them, help them answer those questions? I think, again, one of the great things about the Synod is it shows us the importance of developing those ministries within the church. But secondly, the second thing I take from these statistics is that the people who say we didn't think we would be missed, the Spirit is, I want to suggest, speaking through them. It's no longer enough to simply go to church. Of course it is for many people, but increasingly it isn't. For young people it certainly isn't. The idea of just turning up to Mass, the service station model of Catholicism, as I call it, is again collapsing around us. The Catholics of today are much more committed. They know why they're at Mass. They're seeking growth, and that will be increasingly true of the future. So that's the overall picture. And your question about the rise of young traditionalists is a fruit or a product of this same shift of era. But those young people are looking for a certainty which they believe the church once had in the 1950s, and they believe that the church needs to recover. They're wrong. The church didn't have, in other words, they're focusing on the 50s or the pre-council period. In fact, the church has always been changing throughout history. But they, for their own psychological needs, feel the need, and I understand that, in an uncertain relativistic world. And by the way, I think there's a challenge also for the church. Do we present a strong enough commitment and identity to young people when we offer our faith? But yeah, I see the rise of traditionalism as part of the same thing. Even so, France, UK, United States are really the only countries where traditionalists are a movement, and they're still very, 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 very small, and I don't think they're getting bigger. Thanks. Oh yeah, the question about Roach. I think Cardinal Roach, I have to be careful what I say here, I think Cardinal Roach will be an important reference point in the conclave, and many people will seek his advice.
Just coming back to this word, the pazienza. So when Mary says, "Be it done unto me according to thy word," is that the embodiment of pazienza? Is that? Because there's no relationship with failure there. But I'm just trying to grapple with where you're going.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about Paciencia and Mary, I would associate much more with her words, which is Mary pondered these things in her heart. Yeah. In other words, Mary creates space for understanding what God is doing in her life and in the lives of those around her. She's not reacting immediately to try to, there's that capacity for waiting patiently, I would say. But yeah, docility is part of it. Docility to God's will is indeed part of paciencia. Yeah.
Thanks. With regards to the point of why did Christ need to suffer, why is it that failure is important? Do you perhaps not think that in terms of these big macro trends, I take your point about how the church constantly needs to change, but isn't there also these great trends, if you look at biblical history, that happen irregardless? And are we not perhaps the biggest issue with the church in Europe and the Western world is the material success of society, and that is what dampens the spirit. If you compare it to Africa, where there's still that hunger, literal hunger, which is also associated with spiritual hunger.
Yeah. Of course, I agree with you. I mean, the reason that Western society has ceased to be spiritual as much as it has is because it has become material. And what we mean by that is to say that people trust much more in material possessions and in individual success and individual self-sufficiency. I mean, the thing about prosperity is that it encourages the illusion of self-sufficiency. When we're doing well, when we're rich, when we're healthy, it's very easy to believe that, hey, things are great. We don't need anybody, right? We don't need other people. We don't need God. Hey, who needs that stuff, right?
But what does the church do within that context?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's much that the church can do to prevent a society becoming, liberal, capitalist, consumerist, whatever you want to call it. What the church has to do is to be faithful to its witness within the context with which it finds itself. Okay. Right now, as I say, we've lived through these decades of peaceful economic growth in the West, which has produced one kind of society. But the church is present across the world. It's in countries that are at war. It's in countries that are very, very poor. It's in all kinds of different contexts. And the gospel that it proclaims, obviously it's the same gospel, but the emphasis that it places is going to be different from country to country. And I would say right now in the West, what the church needs to be doing above all is learning how to become a place of, I was going to say refuge, but it's not a refuge from the world. It's a place of, it's the battlefield hospital, to use Francis's metaphor. In other words, a place which offers another way of living to people who have learnt that they are mere commodities, that they're valued for their worth or they're valued for their looks. They feel that they are worthless because that's how society has treated them. That in the church they encounter a place where their worth, intrinsic worth, is recognized. And the joy of that, the joy of the community, all those things that, as it were, individualist, very brutal society doesn't give people, the church must offer. And I think, by the way, the church is beginning to grow in the way that I just suggested, precisely because society is becoming more and more brutal, more and more technocratic, more and more individualistic, and more people are ending up, as it were, on the slag heap, cast aside, the culture, the throwaway culture, as Francis calls it. There's something going on there that the church has to respond to. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, are we being that? Are we doing that? Are we that sign in our society?
I go to the corner, that's my corner there. Speaker's corner of Seven Oaks. Thank you. That was amazing talk. And when you've spoken about the church, a need of adopting, it brings to mind that the idea of missionary church, where actually our Archbishop John very much proclaims in every step, in every sermon, every homily, every letter. He always says we need to be a missionary church. We need to go and really seek people, but also continue to accompany people around. And that brings very much something that I reflected upon reading your book, First Belong to God. I think it was day 7 of the retreat, when it says about a hope, that hope is not born of strength but encounter, not of success but encounter, not of strength but surrender. And I think as we're approaching the Holy Easter Triduum, this really brings us to that surrender, that we see Jesus not yet very much as that triumphant in a human way, in a heart of looking with the eyes of faith. He is the one who wins. He is the triumphant King. But we see him also as the one who surrenders himself to the will of the Father and the hands of his oppressors for their sake, for their salvation, for each and every one of us. And I think that represented that church who needs to really kind of come down from the pedestal of the authority and really show the compassionate, sacrificial side, that the church is for people, because as Christ is for people, the church must be as well. Thank you very much for the beautiful reflection And thank you very much to Ben for organizing all those talks this year amazingly well. I think he deserves a big applause. Thank you to Christobel and Alfred for feeding our guests very much, and everyone who was hosting.